Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we celebrate Hannukah, JVP style. Let's get started. Welcome to the final episode of the JDR podcast for this season. I cannot believe that we are rounding off season 3 of this podcast. This week, back in 2021, I decided, why not start a podcast? I honestly thought maybe people wouldn't even bother listening and it would last a week or two, and I'd realized that no one really cared what I had to say. And at this point, a couple years later, I am floored at the fact that I'm still making episodes and that I have so many people listening to it all over the world. Without any exaggeration, this podcast has been heard on literally every single continent of this earth and listened thousands and thousands of times by people like you. And I couldn't do this without you, as cliche as it is to say. Over the years, I've heard from many of you through our social media, jdr.podcast. I talked to many of our followers, and I've even read the reviews on various podcasting host sites, places like Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Please feel free to give us a rating and comment. As always, you're all welcome to message us on jdr.podcast if you're on Instagram. We respond to everybody and love to hear what people have to say. With that being said, I wanted to do something a little bit different this year. Typically, we like to do the Hannukah special. If any of you are interested in some really cool things we've talked about in regards to Hannukah over the last few years, you can listen to episode 44 from 2022 and episode 83 from 2023, both different ways of talking about Hannukah, which is really, really important at this time of year. But this week, I thought I would do something a little different. In our last episode about Hannukah, a year ago, we talked about the irony in the fact that Hannukah is a very Zionist holiday. It is a time that we remember that we retook control of our Holy Land that we were definitely in for thousands of years, and yet people who believe Jews don't belong there still wish us happy Hannukah because they don't really know what Hannukah is. And it's just very ironic. So it made me think. We are all dealing right now with all of these groups trying to delegitimize Israel, delegitimize the Jewish people, claim we never came from there, despite all the history. And I was wondering, what do groups like JVP, or Jewish Voices for Peace, say about holidays like this? We've seen how Jewish Voices for Peace have attempted to take things like Passover, which also is a holiday in the Jewish tradition that talks about leaving and getting to Israel, being in the state of Israel, despite them claiming we were never there. How do they finesse the Hannukah story? How do they get through this Hannukah issue of being a celebration about taking back your land from colonizers when they themselves believe that Jews are colonizing the land? And so for this episode, I thought it'd be fun to look at the Hannukah story through the JVP lens. I myself have not really gone through this before, so you and I are going to learn about the JVP Hannukah story together. And just a little background for those of you who might be either new to the podcast or have never heard of Jewish Voices for Peace before. The Jewish Voices for Peace movement or group is, I assume, made up of supposedly Jewish people, and their vision, according to their website, is that they envision a world where all people, from the U.S. to Palestine, live in freedom, justice, equality, and dignity, like generations of Jewish leftists before us. We fight for the liberation of all people. We believe that through organizing, we can and will dismantle the institutions and structures that sustain injustice and grow something new, joyful, beautiful, and life-sustaining in their place. It is a very noble cause. Although, I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, these are not the first ever Jewish people to be what we call self-hating Jews, disconnected Jews, people who clearly don't understand their own scriptures because maybe they haven't been taught it, or because they want to be tokenized and fit in a society that, let's be honest at this point, hates Jews. So if you're an American Jew who wants to fit in with a bunch of rabid anti-Semites, maybe you create a group where you disown your Judaism, where you talk down your religious history, you disconnect yourself from the state of Israel. And this is what JVP is. I would say, a bunch of disconnected, miseducated Jews who don't understand their own history and their own culture, who pass along this misinformation in order to try and convince other Jewish people to join them rather than the 95+% of Jews who clearly support Israel. So that is, in a nutshell, who these people are. And so it won't surprise you when these type of people join a group where they have to finesse the history, they got to change the Jewish culture, they have to take the holidays, which all center around the state of Israel and the Jewish people being in the state of Israel, and change things around a little bit in order to justify why they think Jews don't belong there. We've seen this for many holidays, but Hannukah is a really difficult one to do, considering it is so on the nose for what's happening today. The fact that the Jews of Judea were trying to decolonize from an oppressive occupier, the Greeks, and it's exactly what the Jews are trying to do today, except this time from the Arabs. So as a Jewish group, if we are supporting the Jewish people kicking out an oppressor and then not supporting modern day Jews kicking out oppressors, it seems kind of disconnected and weird. So we might need to change the story a little bit to try and justify why it is different this time. We as Jews can celebrate Hannukah, but also not celebrate the exact same thing happening in Israel today, because it's different. And let's see how they do that. According to Jewish Voices for Peace's own website, they put out a pamphlet for people who want to celebrate Hannukah but do it in the, I guess, non-Zionist way. And so this is things that you are supposed to think about as a Jewish person during the holiday when you light your candles. On the first night, they say, not by might, not by power, but by spirit. That's the theme of the night. According to them, we currently live in a 21st century reality in which military might impacts almost every aspect of our world, at home and abroad. We see a rise in militarism that too often targets the vulnerable populations and communities of color. Our sacred task is to resist with a force more powerful. Imagine all of our lights together illuminating the future that we want to see. Let each one of these 8 nights be a remembrance of the people whose resistance and spiritual light cast out the power and fear of militarism. In the pamphlet, it also points out that the Haftorah, which is a special section you read alongside the Torah in your synagogue this week, that quotes Zechariah 4:6, suggesting, quote, not by might and not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. And they suggest that the rabbis are very aware of how militarism and might is a problem. And when the Maccabees did what they did by taking over by military force, they're claiming that God didn't like this. It is dangerous for the Jewish people to put their faith in military power, so we shouldn't do it, according to them. What is really funny about this section, from literally just a basic search on Zechariah 4:6, one of the prophetic books, is that this section that they use as a quote to justify why spirituality is more important than militarism, and that's the lesson of Hannukah, because the prophet Zechariah was talking about a completely different time period. He was talking in the 4th century about, rather than using military might in order to overthrow the Babylonian Empire that took us away from our homeland, his suggestion is that your faith in God will help you get back to Israel, which we know did actually happen when the Persians took over and Darius led us back into Israel, and he funded the building or rebuilding of the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. So they take this completely out of context idea from Zechariah to try and justify their claim that militarism is bad, what Israel is doing with their military today is bad, and we should just do, I guess, hopes and prayers rather than militarism to stop Hamas and the resistance, as they call it. It is actually pretty funny how they attempt to use scripture in order to bolster their point, but then simply reading the scripture itself, you realize it has nothing to do with what they're talking about. But I guess their followers don't actually read from the Torah or understand any of the Jewish history, so who cares? We'll put a fancy little quote in there that makes it seem like this is based in scripture, so therefore we can justify our stance. But as you can see, clearly, night 1, maybe we'll call that a miss rather than a hit when it comes to their ability to try and change this holiday into being some sort of anti-military holiday, despite the fact that the Maccabees took over by force, and not way before when Zechariah was talking about trying to overthrow the Persian Empire and leaving that incident to God. Let's move on to night 2, which the theme for this night is religious freedom. The real history behind the story of Hannukah is painful and complex. In the days before the Maccabean revolt, Judea was firmly under the control of the Seleucid Empire, which was led by Antiochus Epiphanes. The Jewish elite of Judea had become largely Hellenized, the dominating culture of the day. In reality, the Jewish zealots, led by the Maccabees, fought as fiercely against the assimilated Jewish Hellenists as they did against the Seleucid Empire. One lesson we should learn from Hannukah is that religious intolerance is not only something that is imposed upon us from without, it often exists and proliferates within our own communities as well. As we light the second light tonight, we ask, where does religious prejudice and persecution exist in our own communities? What I find really funny about this night is that obviously we're admitting that the Jews were in Judea and that the Jews were under an occupation, so at least they get some points for accuracy there and not trying to mess with that. But I find it really funny that a group definitely known for being anti-Jewish in many senses, going against the Jewish grain, throwing out Jewish practice and becoming assimilated themselves, I am absolutely not surprised that they picked an entire day to mark the fact that we as Jews shouldn't be picking on them. They're Jewish too, despite the fact that they are literally changing the meaning of all of our holidays and going against everything Judaism believes in. But let's not judge one another. Let's let them try to make a case for why Jews should be out of that land. The irony that they are not siding with the Maccabees, but they are actually siding with the Jews who went along with their Greek colonizers, which is pretty much what they're doing themselves today. So isn't that nice that they chose a day to justify their own actions in the Hannukah story? They aren't technically wrong that the Maccabees did fight the Hellenized Jews, because they, unfortunately, supported a colonizer. And as we can see with JVP, it is not that hard for Jews to want to maybe change a few things to get along in a society of other people. Give away some of your Jewish traditions, don't do this, don't do that in order to fit in. And the irony is that they marked an entire day to say, don't blame us for turning our back on the Jewish people. Let's think about how that's a good thing or something. I just find it a little bit comical that they actually worked in a night to mark the fact that they are such a fringe group in the Jewish community and trying to beg people to stop criticizing them for being such a fringe group. It's ironic. A little bit selfish if you ask me. If we move on to night number 3, the theme of this night is sacred joy. On Hannukah, we offer songs of prayers and joy. We gather together to joyfully celebrate the Festival of Lights. We gather around the festive meal of latkes and sufganiyot. Joy, or simcha, is a sacred practice of cultural and spiritual resistance. Jewish tradition repeatedly teaches us to connect with joy, even in the face of destruction. Those who struggle for justice must strive for joy to sustain us, even as we do the painful work of dismantling racism and xenophobia. What brings you joy on this night of Hannukah? I'll be honest, it seems like they kind of phoned this one in. Like maybe they started on day 1 and day 2 and then kind of ran out of ideas for the next few days. It is a little lacking of context and of support in the text, I guess. They don't even mention the time of Hannukah, but nonetheless, they aren't wrong in the fact that the Jews have found ways to celebrate simchas and joy in order to even get rid of colonizing powers. It is definitely a thing of the Jews. I do struggle, though, because as much as the Jewish people, despite everything that's happened to us, always find the love and the joy in everything, they're supporting the anti-Israel side, which I don't really know if I've ever seen, quote, joy from any of their protests. Whereas you see like the pro-Israel side singing great songs and being joyful and dancing in the streets in order to show their love for Israel with their Israeli flags. I don't think I've ever seen that on the other side. I've never seen happy faces. I see frothing mouths screaming to destroy Israel, to kill all the Jews, to bring intifada. I don't think these people have much joy at all. I mean, I don't follow them home after their protests. Maybe they have some joy at home. But let's just be honest here. They have no joy. They simply want to destroy us. So it is kind of ironic that they want the other side, the people who are against the joyful Jews dancing in the streets, to practice joy. Are we celebrating the deaths of 1,200 people in Israel? Are we celebrating the rockets that are falling? The Houthis? We should be having dance parties? I'm not exactly sure what we're supposed to be celebrating if we're not celebrating with the Jews holding the flags and celebrating Israel. I guess if I want to be generous, there was probably a lot of celebrations on October 8th on college campuses from many of these JVP people celebrating the death of the Jews. So I guess find your joy wherever you can find it? I don't know, this one is a stretch. Let's just hope that number 4 is a little bit better. Number 4 is celebrating the light and the dark. On Hannukah, we light an increasing number of candles at the darkest time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. The legacy of racism in our consciousness uses light and dark as metaphors for good and bad, or hope and despair. On Hannukah, we were given the opportunity to notice and reframe these patterns of thought and language. On this 4th night, which echoes the 4th night of creation, in which the sun and the moon were co-created to form day and night, we honor the sacred interplay between light and dark. This one kind of even seems worse than number 3, if I could be honest. I have no idea what they're talking about, except for maybe what they mean by reframing things. It's remember what you think is good and evil? Let's flip it and reframe it. When you think Israel defending its people is good, maybe reframe it and think about how that hurts other people and the terrorists are dying. And maybe we should rethink the idea that Israel is doing the right thing by protecting and saving its people, and reframe it to be that, let's say, Israel are a bunch of colonizers. Let's rethink good and evil. They don't give you really any justification in scripture or in reality on why we should do that. They're just telling you to do it. Take my word for it. Not quite sure why we have to take their word for it or why we have to change good and evil, and they give you literally no examples of it. But racism in general is bad. Pretty sure all Jews believe racism is bad. That doesn't have anything to do with the Gaza-Israel situation right now. But we should rethink it all. For some reason. I hate to say they seem to be going downhill since number 1. But let's see what number 5 says. The 5th night's theme is abundance. According to the Hannukah story in the Talmud, the oil of the temple menorah was only enough for 1 day, but lasted for 8 days. Amidst an increasing culture of secrecy, how can we rededicate ourselves to a world of plenitude? How will we recommit to a vision of economic justice, a society that stands down with hoarding of wealth and affirms there is enough to go around for everybody, to a vision of open borders where all are welcome? Again, I really don't see how this has anything to do with Hannukah. If anything, I hate to say this is kind of like the opposite of the Hannukah story. The Hannukah story was not about open borders because they wanted to kick out the colonizing Greeks. So it's kind of like, we don't want you in our borders. And ironically, the Jewish people already have plans for how they're going to deal with wealth inequality. It's called tzedakah, charity. We do it all the time. I kind of wonder if this open borders thing that they added is a slight hint to the quote-unquote checkpoints that Palestinians have to go through, aka border crossings, to a sovereign nation. And I wonder if this is a slight hint they're trying to make the claim that Palestinian Arabs shouldn't have to cross any borders. They should be welcomed into the state of Israel. If they're terrorists, not terrorists, if they have ill intention, doesn't matter. Everybody is welcome to either enjoy Israel or kill some Jews in a terrorist attack. And let's get to the 6th night. Being open to change. Tonight, we might consider that in whatever situation we find ourselves right now, it will not be the same tomorrow. Change is constant. For those who struggle for justice in our world, this year has brought many changes, losses, gains, victories, and defeats. It will change, and then change again. How do we find the wherewithal to keep this struggle going in a dynamic and ever-changing world? This point, I think they actually make some sense. I think for a group that probably suffers a lot of failures, considering no one really agrees with them, no one believes them, They're on the side of the people who would kill them in a minute once they're no longer useful. I guess I would be okay with teaching, hey guys, we're going to fail a lot, so get used to it. You know, the fact that we've been trying to destroy Israel and the Jewish people from the inside for who knows how many years now, and Israel is still there and it's still thriving. And on the other side of the road at our protest, there are a bunch of Jews who are celebrating and dancing and having fun and being happy about their life. Yeah, that kind of sucks to see once in a while. But, you know, on day number 6, get used to it and accept the reality. Life is forever changing. Maybe we'll win one in the future. And then the 7th night, which the theme is steadfastness. They give a nice quote from a Palestinian person from the past about his olive trees, and then follow it with, the centrality of oil in the Talmudic story of Hannukah reminds us of the importance of steadfastness. Making the olive oil itself is a practice in patience and resolve. Olive trees grow for centuries and even for generations. They bear witness. They are the ancestors of this struggle, bearing fruit to sustain us in the future. For Palestinians, olive oil is a symbol for both steadfastness and cultural survival and resistance. This night of Hannukah, how will you honor the steadfastness of the Palestinian people? What will you do to ensure the Palestinian steadfastness will be rewarded with a bountiful harvest? Obviously, you and I can both understand that the Palestinians existing in any celebrations of Hannukah is ridiculous. The Palestinians didn't exist when the Israelites were here and the Maccabees were fighting the Greeks. There was no such thing as Palestinians. There was no such thing as Palestine. So why they are even in a story marking the people of Israel is beyond me. But let's pretend that there's some justification for it. This idea that they are trying to present, that the olive oil is a sign of generations and the olive trees have been there sustaining people forever, such a beautiful idea. Except they've got it backwards because they have a false history that they run off of. Why is it that when we're telling a story about the Jewish people reclaiming their land, getting olive oil from a place in the north to bring it to the temple that's been rededicated, that we're worried about the Palestinians and the olive trees that have seen their generations? Shouldn't we be talking, as we are, about the Jewish people and their olive trees? That's pretty much what this story is about. Why is it that they can at the same time say, remember the past, remember the ancestors, tell a story about those ancestors, the Jews, and then say that the olive trees belong to the Palestinians, even though we're talking about a story about Jews using those olive trees? It really makes no sense, but they had to shoehorn this idea in because that's really the entire goal of this group, is it has nothing to do with Jewish voices for peace. It is all about adding Palestinian narratives, false narratives, into Jewish history. Something that the JVP people don't know or don't care is the fact that the Palestinian Arab people that were created in the 1960s really haven't been steadfast. All they have really done is become victims of themselves and cried out to the world for more and more and more help so they can essentially go nowhere. Not one Palestinian Arab today is actually looking to be resettled, have a life. The Palestinians are living in a perpetual refugee status put onto them by people like JVP and the world in order to be forever victims, to maintain and continue the Nakba narrative where they are on pause until the world sorts out whatever the hell they are going to sort out to give them a state, according to JVP. The only thing I could say that the Palestinian Arabs do when it comes to steadfastness is steadfastly holding to the idea to never make peace, to turn down every single peace deal they are offered, to turn down every single state they're offered, and to literally not move 1 inch towards a future until they eventually get rid of the Jews. Think about the billions and billions of dollars they've taken in from the international world that they have essentially sent to their leaders and never demanded more. A steadfastness might be demanding your own leadership, so-called leadership, actually spend that money on the people, on improving their lives, on the land that they currently have. Gaza could have been the Singapore of the Middle East when Israel left in 2005. The West Bank or Judea and Samaria could be so much better if the Palestinian Authority wasn't corrupt and stealing all of their money. This idea that JVP puts out not only is distorting history, but the reality is that the only steadfast thing that we're celebrating about the Palestinian people right now is the refusal to actually make forward progress. And I don't think that should be celebrated. I think, unfortunately, they should get better leadership, and they should actually demand more from their leadership and start moving forward. And for the final 8th night, honoring our ancestors. This one I can agree with. I think they finally hit one that actually makes some sense. In the Al-Hanisim prayer we say on Hannukah, we honor the miracles that took place in the days of old, as in our own day. Tonight, as we light the final candle of this festival, we give thanks for the miracle of light that burns within, among, and beyond us. We are not alone and never have been. We are a part of a beautiful earth and the night sky, lives that came before our own, and all that sustains us, and all that we sustain. To whom would you like to dedicate this candle to tonight? In whose memory or towards what struggle would you like to dedicate tonight's lighting? I think most of my listeners could agree with this. I think we should light candles in dedication to those who have struggled, to those who have fought. That's exactly what Hannukah is about, is thinking about our ancestors in their homeland, in Israel, struggling against an occupying force, the Greeks, and every other generation after that living in Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East. We have constantly been going through struggles, and all of our ancestors have brought us here today to fight for this same struggle today in a current world that hates us as much or more as they hated us back then. And the irony of the fact that Jewish Voices for Peace got this right, except they, I'm sure, are celebrating the struggles of Palestinian terrorists and people who are in Israeli jails as quote-unquote resistance fighters. They are celebrating the death and mutilation of people in Israel, whereas we are celebrating all of those who fought and died to get us to this point. Like the Maccabees, they struggled against all odds to get us to where we are today, and to be strong and proud Jews with a strong and proud Israeli state that can protect us and everyone else who lives there, no matter what your religion is, or what your background is, or what your skin color is. Israel is a light and a beacon around the world, but especially in the Middle East. So the JVP kind of got it right on the 8th night. We should light a candle and remember our ancestors. And in the end, that is the lesson we can take for this Hannukah. Out of all of the stuff that JVP puts out, all of it is, as you can hear, complete BS, a complete twisting of narratives, a hijacking of our own faith by people who claim to be a part of this faith. People who have to come up with excuses and reasons why they keep failing at destroying the Jewish state. They made a mistake in putting out a JVP Hannukah, because there is no way to have Hannukah that is not pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, pro-Jewish, because that is the story of Hannukah. You can't change that. As much as you pretend that we can twist some stories around or make things mean other things, that's not going to happen. Hannukah is and will forever be a proud Jewish holiday that will mark the Jewish people reclaiming their land and reclaiming their faith from the corruption of an occupying force and from people within who are willing to change that Judaism in order to fit in with that occupying force, or to not be bullied by those occupiers like JVP is. For all of my listeners, whether Jewish or not Jewish, I wish you the most happiest of Hanukahs and Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Please stay safe, and we'll see you next year in Season 4 of the Jewish Diaspora Report podcast. And as always, don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast, and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.